Number 1. Steve Sansom and Gemma Watts.
Steven Sansom, for the murder of Sarah Mayhew, I sentence you to life imprisonment. I set no minimum term in your case. That means that you will spend the rest of your life in prison. For perverting the course of public justice, the sentence is 5 years imprisonment concurrent.
Back in early March 2024, there was this woman named Sarah Mayhew. She was 38, had 2 kids, just a regular mom trying to navigate life. She'd met Steve Sansom online through a dating site. He was a 45-year-old man living down in Sutton in South London. But here's the thing that Sarah had no idea about. This man was seriously dangerous. We're talking about someone who'd already spent nearly 20 years behind bars for murdering a taxi driver back in 1998. Terrence Boyle, 59 years old, and Sansom killed him on Christmas Eve of all days. He was out on what they call a life license, which means he was supposed to be monitored for the rest of his life. But here's where it gets even more twisted. He wasn't working alone this time. He was involved with Gemma Watts, who was 49, and these two had some seriously sick fantasies they'd share with each other. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of messages back and forth over months, discussing violence, humiliation, pain, and even killing someone during sex. It's stomach-turning stuff. At one point, Sansom actually told Watts he was planning to have Sarah over to his place. Watts's response? Only if it's a deal she ain't leaving in one piece. And Sansom just replied, okay. Can you imagine? They were literally planning this woman's death like they were discussing what to have for dinner. So Sarah shows up at his flat around 11 p.m. on March 8th. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive, because what happened next is just pure evil. In the days after Sarah disappeared, security cameras caught Sansom and Watts out shopping. But they weren't buying groceries. They were picking up hacksaws, blades, bleach, and even an incinerator bin. When police finally got into that flat, they found Sarah's blood everywhere: the bedroom, bathroom, kitchen. There was no question about what had gone down in there. About a month later, in April, some poor dog walker is out in Rowdown Fields in New Erdington when they stumble across parts of Sarah's body. Then weeks after that, more remains turned up in the River Wandle in Mitcham. The forensic tests confirmed what everyone feared. It was definitely Sarah. As the police dug deeper into this case, they realized just how much these two had planned everything out. Not only had they been exchanging these sick messages for months, but they'd actually been researching how to get rid of a body. Sarah thought she was just going to meet someone for a date. She had absolutely no clue she was walking into a death trap. And get this, Sansom was using red rum as his Facebook name, which if you spell it backwards is murder. How's that for a red flag? Then just 2 days after they killed Sarah, this psychopath posts on Facebook. Best friends are those who don't say anything when you show up at their door with a dead body. They just grab a shovel and follow you. I mean, the arrogance is just unbelievable. Both of them eventually admitted to murdering Sarah and trying to cover it up. Their sentencing happened on January 30th, 2025 at the Old Bailey. The judge didn't mince words, calling it a bloodthirsty and wicked fantasy. Sansom got what they call a whole life order, which means he's never getting out. Never. Watts got life too, but with a minimum of 30 years before she can even think about parole. Sarah's father was there in court, and you could hear the pain in his voice when he said, "Whatever sentence you may receive will never compare to the pain you have caused us." This wasn't some crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was cold, calculated murder that they planned out, talked about, and carried out without a shred of remorse. A family lost someone they loved because she made the mistake of trusting the wrong people. Right now, Steve Sansom is locked up in a high-security prison somewhere in England, and he'll die there. Gemma Watts is also behind bars, and if she's lucky enough to live that long, she won't even be eligible for parole until 2055. Now, the second case is about Axel Rudakubana, and this one is particularly tough to talk about. Back in July 2024, something terrible happened in Southport, England, that really shook the whole community and got people across the country asking how something like this could have been prevented. Axel Rudakubana was just 18 years old when he carried out a knife attack at a children's dance workshop. This was on July 29th, and the class was Taylor Swift themed. You know, little girls making friendship bracelets and singing along to her songs. What happened that day became one of the worst incidents involving children in modern UK history. That morning, Rudakubana had booked a taxi from his home in Banks, West Lancashire, to get to the Hart Street venue. He arrived just before noon, and security cameras caught him asking for directions before he went into the studio building. Inside, there were 26 children with their dance teacher and an assistant. Within seconds of him entering, everything went wrong. When emergency services got there, they saw children running out of the studio, some of them badly hurt. The police footage and witness videos from that day show first responders arriving to what must have been an unimaginable scene. Officers managed to tackle Rudakubana and arrest him right there. 3 young girls died that day: Biba King, Elsie Stancombe, and Alice da Silva Aguiar. Several other children and adults were injured too. The impact on these families and everyone in Southport has been enormous and continues to be. But here's the thing. This didn't come out of nowhere. There were warning signs going back years. Rudakubana had been struggling with mental health issues and violent thoughts for nearly 5 years before this happened. When he was just 13, he actually called Childline talking about disturbing thoughts he was having. That led to him being permanently kicked out of mainstream school. From there, his behavior just kept getting worse. He was bringing weapons to school, he attacked another student, and he became obsessed with violence and mass attacks. Multiple agencies knew about him: safeguarding teams, law enforcement. He was referred to Prevent, which is the UK's program for preventing extremism, 3 separate times. But because he didn't seem to have any clear political or ideological motivation, they didn't classify him as a terror threat. There were several incidents, including one where he was found on a bus carrying a knife, but instead of arresting him, authorities just sent him home. By early 2023, Axel had basically stopped engaging with mental health services completely. He hadn't been in school for almost a year and was spending more and more time online, looking up information about weapons and historical attacks. When investigators looked into his background later, they found out he'd been downloading extremist material and had even tried to make ricin, which is a deadly poison, in his bedroom. Even though safeguarding teams kept having contact with him, he remained isolated, and his behavior kept escalating without anyone really noticing the full picture. Looking back, it's clear there were so many chances to step in and help, but it seems like all the different agencies weren't really talking to each other properly. On January 23, 2025, so just recently, Axel Rudakubana was sentenced at Liverpool Crown Court to life in prison with a minimum of 52 years. That's actually the longest sentence ever given to someone his age in the UK. He'll be eligible for a parole review when he's 70, though it's pretty unlikely he'll actually be released. The judge said that if Rudakubana had been an adult when he did this, he would have gotten a whole life sentence, meaning never getting out. But under UK law, you can't sentence minors to life without any possibility of parole. This case has really gotten people looking more closely at youth mental health services, how counterterrorism units share information with local police, and whether early intervention systems are actually working. Right now, Axel Rudakubana is in a high-security prison serving his sentence. His case is expected to be a major focus in an upcoming public inquiry that will look at how the various institutions failed to prevent this tragedy. Number 3. Ian Black. Back in July 2023, there was this guy named Christopher Henderson, 55 years old, father of 4 kids. He'd just had another baby. His youngest son was only 12 days old at the time. Christopher was living in his flat in Bensham, Gateshead, just trying to get on with his life. But within weeks of becoming a new dad again, he was dead from severe head injuries. The person who killed him was Ian Black, a 42-year-old who happened to be a trained boxer. Black was actually engaged to Christopher's stepdaughter, so they knew each other well. He lived pretty close by on Havelock Terrace. Now, this guy had a reputation for being aggressive and having violent outbursts. People knew to be careful around him. On the night this all happened, Black had been drinking heavily and doing cocaine. Earlier that day, he'd actually gone over to Christopher's place to ask for money and do more drugs. At some point during this visit, they got into an argument. Apparently, Christopher had told his stepdaughter that he'd heard Black had cheated on her with another woman in a hospital toilet of all places. Black left the flat after this, but he didn't go far. He came back angry, drunk, and high, ready for a fight. What happened next was all captured on security cameras in the building. Right there in the corridor outside Christopher's flat, Black launched into this brutal 4-minute attack. The first punch he threw knocked Christopher out cold. But instead of stopping there, Black just kept going. For the next several minutes, he repeatedly stomped on Christopher's head, 18 times total. And between the stomping, he was going through the man's pockets and trashing his flat. When the paramedics finally got there, Christopher was barely hanging on. He had multiple facial fractures, his skull was fractured, and he had serious brain damage. He never woke up. 13 days after the attack, on July 29, 2023, Christopher was declared dead at Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. When this case went to trial at Newcastle Crown Court, the prosecutors didn't hold back. They called the killing vicious, brutal, and drawn out. The judge said Black's actions were calculated and considered. Christopher never had a fighting chance. He was completely at Black's mercy. Initially, Black tried to deny he'd committed murder, but halfway through the trial, he changed his mind and pleaded guilty. On Wednesday, January the 22nd, 2025, so just a couple weeks ago, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 19 and a half years before he can even think about parole. He also got an extra 6 months for having amphetamines that he was planning to sell. Christopher's death absolutely destroyed his family. His sister spoke in court about what kind of person he was. She described him as kind and loving, really talented as an artist and dancer, always had people around him who cared about him. She mentioned that they'd had a tough childhood because their mother abandoned them, but Christopher had grown up to be someone who was deeply loved by everyone in his life. His partner of 15 years, Vicky Elliott, called him a shining light and talked about how he'd raised her children like they were his own. That newborn baby, the one who was just 12 days old when his dad was attacked, he's going to grow up never knowing his father. When the judge was handing down the sentence, he pointed out that Black had a long history of violent behavior. There was even an incident back in 2005 where he broke his own brother's ribs. The judge noted that Black knew perfectly well how alcohol and drugs affected his temper, but he chose to use them anyway. This wasn't someone who just lost their temper for a split second. This was a deliberate, sustained attack that went on for minutes. It took away a partner, a father, a brother, and a friend from people who loved him. Right now, Ian Black is locked up in a high-security prison somewhere in the UK. The earliest he could possibly get out is 2044, and that's only if he's granted parole when he becomes eligible. Number 4, Anthony Gardiner. Back in January 2022, there was a 76-year-old man named John Coxon living in Stonehouse, Gloucestershire. Now, I need to be upfront with you about something. Coxon was a registered sex offender who had several convictions for child sexual offenses and had served time back in 2016. This wasn't a secret in his community, and it's important context for what happened next. Enter Anthony Gardiner, a 66-year-old neighbor who knew all about Coxon's past. You might think this story is heading towards some kind of vigilante justice scenario, but that's not what this was about at all. This was about greed, pure and simple. Gardiner had been systematically taking advantage of this elderly, vulnerable man for money. In 2021, Gardiner had actually taken Coxon to a building society, spinning some story about how he deserved up to £500 as a reward for finding Coxon's lost wallet. Thankfully, the bank staff got suspicious and called the police, so no money changed hands that day. But in Gardiner's mind, Coxon still owed him this debt, and he was going to collect one way or another. On January 12, 2022, one of Coxon's carers arrived at his home and found him unconscious on his kitchen floor. The 76-year-old, who was already dealing with Alzheimer's disease and severe diabetes, had been brutally attacked in his own home. He was rushed to the hospital with serious facial injuries and a traumatic brain injury that caused bleeding in his brain. For 2 months, Coxon fought for his life in that hospital bed, but the injuries were just too severe. Infections started setting in, and eventually his cause of death was recorded as kidney failure. But it was directly caused by that head trauma from the attack. Here's where Gardiner made his first big mistake. He couldn't keep quiet about what he'd done. Even before Coxon died, Gardiner had already been arrested because he'd been bragging to people about going to Coxon's house and stomping on his head. When police seized his trainers for testing, forensic analysis showed they were stained with Coxon's blood. Case closed, right there. As investigators dug deeper into Gardiner's background, they found exactly what you'd expect. A criminal history stretching back decades. We're talking robbery, wounding with intent, assault, battery, and a whole list of other offenses. At the time he murdered Coxon, he was already serving a 5-year sentence for robbing a disabled man with Parkinson's disease. He'd grabbed this poor man by the neck until he handed over his wallet. This was clearly someone who made a habit of targeting vulnerable people. What really stands out about this case is Gardiner's complete lack of remorse. When he was eventually sentenced, he actually treated Coxon's death like it was some kind of joke. He was laughing when he talked about it with family members. In court, representing himself, he had the audacity to tell the judge, Mr. Coxon had 474 images of children on his computer. I'm glad he is dead. Now, during his initial police interviews, Gardiner denied any responsibility. But later, while he was in prison, he wrote a letter to police saying he wanted to come clean. Ended up pleading guilty to murder on December 12, 2024, on January 17, 2025, at Bristol Crown Court. Judge Martin Picton didn't mince words. He called it a brutal attack and described Gardiner as a highly dangerous man who showed not a shred of remorse. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, though it was reduced from 24 because of his guilty plea. John Coxon's brother gave a victim impact statement in court, saying that no one should have to endure what his brother went through. Despite Coxon's past, his brother pointed out that he had done good things in his life, including caring for elderly relatives. Today, Anthony Gardiner is serving his life sentence in prison. The earliest he could possibly be considered for release is 2045, and given his history and complete lack of remorse, that's looking pretty unlikely. Number 5. Sikander Hussain. In February 2024, there was a 65-year-old man named Wallis Webb living in Birmingham. This man wasn't just any ordinary resident, he was genuinely one of those people who made his community better. He'd served on the local council and was known for having a passion for fairness in life and always trying to help people around him. The kind of person you'd be glad to have as a neighbor, you know? But on February 6th, 2024, that kindness and community spirit would make him a target for 25-year-old Sakander Hussain from Knights Close in Erdington. And what happened next shows you just how far some people will go when they see dollar signs instead of human beings. On the morning of February 6th, Wallis Webb was found dead in his home on Baldmore Lake Road. He'd been stabbed to death in what police immediately recognized as a deliberate, calculated attack. But here's where this case takes an especially disturbing turn. Hussain wasn't done with his victim after the murder. In the days following Wallis's death, Hussain had the audacity to use the dead man's bank cards. We're talking over £400 spent at supermarkets and takeaways. Think about that for a second. He'd just taken someone's life, and then he's out there buying groceries and ordering food with the victim's money. Even experienced investigators were shocked by this level of disrespect and callousness because the security cameras tell the whole. CCTV footage shows Hussain casually using Wallis's cards like it's just another day, treating this elderly man's murder like it was some kind of business deal he'd just closed. No guilt, no hesitation, just pure exploitation. Police didn't take long to connect the dots. Just one day after Wallis's body was discovered, on February 7, 2024, officers arrested Hussain at an address on Ingleton Road in Birmingham. The evidence was pretty much overwhelming at this point. Forensics tied him to the stabbing, and his use of Wallis's bank cards left a trail that led straight back to him. 3 days later, on February 10th, Hussain was formally charged with murder and fraud by false representation. He appeared in magistrate's court, and here's something interesting about his response. While he eventually admitted to using the bank cards, he denied the murder charge. It was like he was trying to play some kind of angle, maybe thinking he could somehow minimize what he'd done. When this case went to trial, the contrast between victim and perpetrator couldn't have been starker. On one side, you had Wallis Webb, a very good man who was recognized by the people around him. On the other side was Hussain, a young man who apparently saw this pillar of the community as nothing more than a walking ATM that he could access after committing murder. The prosecution laid it out clearly for the jury. This was someone who had zero regard for human life or basic human dignity. The evidence showed a calculated killer who planned not just to take a life, but to profit from it immediately afterward. In September 2024, the jury came back with their verdict: guilty on both counts, murder and fraud by false representation. When it came time for sentencing in January 2025, the judge handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 21 years before Hussain could even be considered for parole. Today, Sakander Hussain is behind bars serving his life sentence. The earliest he could possibly walk free is 2046, and that's only if he's granted parole when he becomes eligible. Number 6. Abdul Babar, Sikander Babar, and Sultan Bakr. In January 2024, a 30-year-old man named Sadiq Al-Lami from Manchester was driving to meet a friend in the early hours of the morning. At the same time that night, 3 young men were driving down the A34 in South Manchester in a black Mercedes. We're talking about Sultan Bakr, who was 23, and the Babar brothers, Abdul, 19, and Sikander, 25. These 3 had been smoking cannabis and inhaling nitrous oxide, which is a pretty dangerous combination that clearly wasn't helping their decision-making. Around 2 a.m. on January 22nd, these 2 worlds collided at a junction near Pars Wood in East Didsbury. A witness saw the black Mercedes pull up alongside Sadiq's car. The 3 men got out and approached him, and there was some kind of brief confrontation. When Sadiq tried to get away from the situation, they stabbed him 11 times and left him there to die on the road. The whole attack was over in minutes, but these 3 made some crucial mistakes. They left behind a parcel, cigarettes, and several balloons, all containing their DNA. Police found their abandoned Mercedes in Wythenshawe, and security cameras caught them taking a taxi back to their homes. What's really striking about this case is how these 3 acted afterward. They just went about their normal routines like nothing had happened. Abdul Babar was messaging his hairdresser to book a haircut. Sultan Bakr was ordering takeaways, but Abdul was also doing something else. He was checking the Manchester Evening News website just hours after the attack, probably to see if the story had made the news yet. By 7 a.m., his search history showed him reading the breaking news about what they'd done. Then he started searching for a solicitor and got a message from someone telling him to lay low and go back to Pakistan, which he replied was a good idea. So clearly reality was starting to set in. All 3 of them knew they were in deep trouble and started making desperate attempts to get away. Sultan Bakr took a taxi to Manchester Coach Station and bought 2 tickets to London on different routes, trying to cover his tracks. He managed to spend 1 night in the capital before the Metropolitan Police tracked him down. The Babar brothers went for an even more extreme escape plan. A week after the murder, on January the 29th, they were found hiding in the back of a lorry at a recycling center in Essex. Phone evidence showed they were trying to leave the country illegally. Security footage actually caught them climbing out of the lorry just before police arrested them and realized they had murder suspects on their hands. When this case went to trial at Minshul Street Crown Court, it lasted about a month. Detective described it as a stupid road rage incident that spiraled completely out of control into murder. The prosecution showed how all 3 men had tried to destroy evidence and distance themselves from what they'd done, and they even turned against each other in court, each trying to shift the blame onto the others. In January 2025, all 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment for Sadiq's murder. During the sentencing, the court heard from Sadiq's family about losing someone who brought them all together with his daily smile and positive energy. Detective Inspector Wilkinson pointed out that from day 1, these killers had shown no remorse for their actions. And that's really what stands out here. This was a moment of road rage, made worse by drugs and terrible judgment that ended up destroying multiple lives. Sadiq Al-Lami died for absolutely nothing more than being in the wrong place when three reckless young men decided that violence was their answer to whatever happened on that road that night. Today, Abdul Babar, Sikander Babar, and Sultan Bakr are all serving life sentences in prison. Their failed escape attempts just serve as a reminder that no matter how far you run, justice has a way of catching up with you eventually. Number 7. Jaden Gubertini. In May 2023, 17-year-old Cameron Bailey from Brighton made what would turn out to be a fatal decision. He and a friend had traveled to High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, not for sightseeing, but for drugs. What started as a simple transaction would end up costing Cameron his life and leaving his friend with serious injuries. On May 6, 2023, Cameron and his mate encountered 18-year-old Jaden Gubertini from Coe Spur in Slough, Berkshire. But instead of any kind of fair deal, Gubertini robbed them of their drugs and sent them on their way. Now, most people might cut their losses and head home after something like that, but Cameron and his friend decided not to report it to police, probably for obvious reasons, and stayed in the area. That decision to stick around proved to be a massive mistake. The next day, May 7th, Gubertini came back, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd brought backup, 3 accomplices named Aaron Pattinson, Philip Solomon, and Scott Cordes. This wasn't going to be another simple robbery. Around 7 p.m. that evening, in the Easton Street area of High Wycombe, the gang found Cameron and his friend. What happened next went far beyond anything that had occurred the day before. During the confrontation, Gubertini stabbed Cameron in the back, a single wound that would prove fatal. His friend also got attacked, ending up with cuts on his head and hand, plus a fractured skull. Cameron Bailey died from that stab wound. His friend survived, but was left with serious injuries that showed just how vicious this attack was. After the murder, Gubertini knew he was in serious trouble, and not ready of facing the consequences, he fled the country, making his way to the Netherlands. By June 2023, police had identified him as their prime suspect and launched a manhunt. In July of that same year, he was brought back to the UK to face justice. The case went to trial and lasted 9 weeks, a lengthy process that examined every detail of what happened during those 2 days in High Wycombe. The evidence against Gubertini was solid, and the jury didn't take long to reach their conclusion. On Thursday, October 24th, the jury delivered their unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. He was convicted of murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit robbery, and Section 18, grievous bodily harm with intent. But that wasn't his only conviction during this period. While he was in HMP Bullingdon in Bicester awaiting trial, he slashed another inmate, adding another GBH charge to his record. In January 2025, Judge Heather Norton at Reading Crown Court handed down Gubertini's sentence, life imprisonment with a minimum of 29 years before he could even be considered for parole. The fact that Gubertini continued his violent behavior, even while in prison awaiting trial, shows this wasn't someone who was going to be reformed easily. His decision to flee to the Netherlands also suggests he knew exactly how serious his actions were. Number 8. Kyle Dumble. Jack Field was 24 years old, just out celebrating a friend's birthday in Hailsham, Sussex on November 18th. His mate had talked him into joining the group. They'd had a good time, and now they were walking home. Pretty standard Saturday night stuff. Meanwhile, Kyle Dumble, 27, no fixed address, was riding passenger in a Mitsubishi Shogun when his friend spotted Jack's group on the street. The driver got out and started a fight with them. That's when Dumble made his first bad decision of the night. Even though he was banned from driving, Dumble jumped behind the wheel. At first, it looked like he was just helping his mate escape. Drove up to the fight so his friend could get back in. But once his friend was safely inside, Dumble didn't drive away. Instead, he gunned it forward, then started reversing at speed straight toward the group. Jack and another guy tried to duck between some parked cars for cover. Dumble reversed right into those vehicles, crushing Jack underneath and pinning him there. Then he did something that shows this wasn't an accident. He kept driving back and forth over Jack's body. After that, he just drove off, leaving Jack dying on Western Road. When police caught up with him, Dumble was charged with murder, attempted grievous bodily harm, and driving while disqualified. His brother Reese got dragged into it too on intimidation and assault charges, though he was cleared of those. At Hove Crown Court, Dumble tried to deny the murder charge, but there were witnesses, including Jack's friend, who'd convinced him to come out that night. The guy broke down giving his testimony. You can imagine living with that guilt. The prosecution called it what it was, an act of revenge. Dumble had used a 2-ton vehicle as his weapon because he was angry about the fight. On January 24, 2025, the jury found him guilty. 3 days later, he got life with a minimum of 17 years. Jack Field died because he was in the wrong place when someone with a history of bad decisions, already banned from driving, decided revenge mattered more than human life. His friend will probably never stop wondering what would have happened if he hadn't talked Jack into joining them that night. Today, Kyle Dumble won't see freedom again until at least 2042. And that's only if he somehow convinces a parole board that the guy who repeatedly drove over someone in a fit of rage has changed.